let's make a shelf for this built-in. So first, we need to know how long they need to be. When you're measuring the width, be sure to do it in a couple different places. So up here, it's about 25 3/4. Down near the bottom, we could do a full 26, and we need to know how deep they need to be. So it has to be at least 10.5 inches, because that's from the back to these front things here. 11 to 11.5 would match the front edge here. So somewhere between 10.5 and 11.5. That'll be a little bit determined by the types of wood that's available. These are 8-foot boards of wet cedar. They're 5.5, so it's basically a 1x6, but it's actually 5.5 inches. So 2 of these glued together is going to give me 11 inches exactly. Then I just need to cut the lengths to the exact size I want for my shelves. Now, because these were green, I bought them a couple of months ago, and I've been sitting them in my garage here to dry out a little bit before I start working with it. I've clamped the far ends of my boards together to keep them from swiveling around each other. And you can see that from the factory they're not exactly the same length anyways. So I'm just going to be doing a sacrificial cut here to get rid of those ends that have the barcode stapled in, and to make them the same length on this end. If you don't have a miter saw, you could do this with a circular saw or even a hand saw. I'm cutting through 2 pieces of wood at once so that I get the 2 pieces of wood exactly the same length. But if you have a hand saw or a circular saw, you probably would want to do just one at a time and just measure right. I cut one set at 26 and one set at 25 3/4, and I have enough wood to make one more shelf. I don't know if I need 3, I might be enough to have just 2, but I've decided to come in and test these guys and see what I think about the lengths. So this is the 26th, and it fits fine in the front, and up high here it goes all the way to the back, but you can see that 26 is real tight in a few places, so that fits really nicely, but I'm not certain it's going to fit down low. It's certainly not going to go through where this electrical outlet has a cover on it. Well, that fits every place except that electrical outlet cover, but it's pretty tight. If I paint the edges, it could be tricky. Now this here, the 25 3/4, goes in much nicer, and if you look at the gap here, it's, a 1/4 inch gap, but if you spread that out on each side, it's an 1/8 inch gap, and people really aren't going to notice that. So it's up to you just how precise you want to get it when you do these cuts. You're going to need 2 clamps that are wide enough for the width of your shelf, and either a silicone non-stick pad that's big enough, or just a roll of wax paper that you can put down under things so the glue doesn't go through. Now, the wax paper doesn't actually have to be as wide as the shelf itself, it just has to cover this general area where the glue is going to be. Now, my recommendation is to put these guys down with the good side flat, because you're going to be sanding this side over here later anyways, and you want to make sure you find the nicest edge of one of these guys and put it on the outside, so that'll be your shelf front. And if you have messy edges, you can put the messy edges on the inside, although the back doesn't really matter, it's only the front that you really care about. And then you're going to need some wood glue. For interior use, Titebond 2 is perfectly fine. I happen to have the waterproof Titebond 3, so I'm going to use that. Alright, prop it up on one edge. This here is going to be your nice top face, so I'm going to put the glue away from that. A little bit's going to drip down, but we're trying to minimize the amount that drips through that bottom edge to minimize how much sanding we have to do. So I'm putting it up here on what will be the top edge, and gravity will move it down for us. Now this I'm only putting on one side, so you'll want to do enough so it'll coat both sides when you put them together. And your boards have to be reasonably flat for these things to touch each other. Now, a real professional will probably spread this out a little more. I'm just going to set it down tap it, wiggle it around a little bit, and so that wiggling around is going to spread things out for me, I'm hoping. And then we just clamp it. And I'm putting just a tiny bit of pressure on that side until I get this side clamped in place. You want to make sure these two edges are as flush as you can get them, and then increase the pressure on both sides equally. And you will see some glue coming out here. And if your boards are reasonably flat and the surface you're working on is reasonably flat, you won't have them warping up and bouncing and trying to move around. If you do, you might need some weights to put down on this thing to keep it flat while the glue dries. And we're hoping that there will be this amount or less glue coming out the other side as well. Well, it's been about 2 hours, so we have to clamp these for a minimum of 30 minutes. 1 hour is better, so 2 or 3 hours should be fine. It says do not stress the joint for 24 hours, so we're just going to set this aside and glue another one. So all of these faces look quite good. This one here has a tiny little knot on it, so we'll put that on the inside. But any of these other faces would be just fine. The last two boards I did were slightly bowing away from each other in the middle, so I grabbed two other clamps so I could clamp it in the middle as well as the ends to make sure it had a good connection there. Now all we have to do is sand down this side. The other side from the store is finished pretty well, but the back side needs to be sanded down. You can do it by hand, but I recommend a mechanical sander. Also, some type of dust mask is good to have. How much effort you put into sanding these is up to you and how nice you want your shelves to look. So here you can see there's a little bit of discoloration from the glue there, but it's very smooth. And I'm going to be painting these guys with white paint, so I don't mind if it's a little bit of color there. And the back here is just about as smooth as the front. So same thing here. You can see where the glue came through. I knocked it so it's flat, but I'm not too worried about it showing the discoloration. Now in this guy here, you can see that the glue is basically didn't come through at all, and I sanded anything that did come through. So this looks really nice. This is what you're aiming for if you're not going to be painting it or coating it or anything like that. But that takes a little more sanding on it. Now I'm gluing together two boards to get about the width I'm looking for here. That's because these narrow boards are cheaper. But you will have, the grain differences between the two pieces of board. You can buy, a nice piece of board that's the right size here, but it's just going to be a lot more expensive. And this is pine as opposed to cedar. Pine works just fine if you want to use that. So if you buy a board, it's going to be mostly finished on both sides, whereas you buy lumber, you're lucky in this case with the cedar, it's mostly finished on one side, but you're going to be doing a lot more sanding with the lumber. Now before you paint these, you need to clean them off. I just hit this just completely dry cloth, and you can see all the fine sawdust I'm getting off of this. You really need to use rubbing alcohol or water and then let it dry to get all that sawdust off. Now water's a lot cheaper, but it takes a lot longer to dry. I am going to be painting my shelves with a white trim paint, and I have a cabinet roller down there in a tiny little tray for it. I might not use the tray. I might be able to just dip the roller in the paint and transfer it to the shelves. We'll see how that works. If I don't like how it's working out, I'll switch over to using the tray. I have these shelves with the bottom or not as nice sides facing up initially. They're on top of paint points, so I'm going to paint the bottom, flip them over, and then do the top and the edges. Alright, I'm working on bare wood here, so my first coat is definitely not enough. I still have wood texture and pattern showing through. I'm hoping 2 coats will be enough. We'll find out if that's the case or not. The edges of the boards here soak in stuff quite a bit. Alright, this is after 2 coats. You can see on some of these edge grains, the grain just sucks the paint in. Top of the boards are pretty good, but you can see where there's some glue here, the paint is whiter there because it's not being sucked into the board where the glue is. So if you primed it on your first layer, you'd probably be able to do 1 thing of primer and 1 thing of trim paint. But I didn't, and so I'm having issues where knot holes especially are showing through. This one's the best example of that. But I have this knot hole here, and you can see the dark area right there showing through. So I'm going to do a 3rd layer of my trim paint. On the plus side of doing multiple layers, on the bottom, the paint points hit different areas, and so a paint point was here, and it got painted over, and so it's mostly fixing up all my paint point issues. Of course, after 2 layers, I have a few areas like here where the paint came down here and made a little bit of bead there, so I'm sanding that area down, and also places where the paint points were, I'm just hitting them so that it knocks down the little dots. Alright, you can see that they're still made up of 2 boards, but we're pretty much good here. I let these sit for 48 hours before I install them on the shelves because I don't want any paint tacking to the support brackets. Alright, here's the shelves in place. Now, what you consider to be the good side of these shelves might change. So I put the nicest looking side of this shelf down because it's above eye level and people can see it. I mean, obviously these shelves are mostly going to be covered by things, so the top of them doesn't really matter as much as the front face. But then on something like this, where you aren't going to be looking down here unless you bend over, I put the good side on the top. So it kind of depends on where your shelf is of how you want to orient them.